All right, we have opened up the doors. Good afternoon and welcome to today's ATI education webinar facilitated by govmates on the topic of how to meet government security requirements to cross the valley of death. All very smart things that I'm so lucky we have somebody to talk about because that is definitely not my wheelhouse. And so I'm really excited to have today's guest with us. I am your host, Meg O'Hara. I'm GovMate's Director of Engagement, and I will be monitoring the Q&A and facilitating today's discussion, but Tom's going to be the brains behind the entire chat today. For those who might not know GovMates, we are a technology scouting platform connecting small and non-traditional businesses with system integrators and agencies who are seeking innovative solutions to their federal challenges. So we provide matchmaking, education, resources, and more for ATI and our ecosystem. So to get us started today, I would like to provide you with a few participation reminders if this is the first time you're joining us or if it has been a while since you have joined us. So first things first, remove those distractions. We're going to keep things to about an hour. So you can silence your phone. This is like a great reason not to check your email. You can actually throw some lunch in if you have the time, that sort of thing. So we encourage you to be present. We also encourage you to be active in the chat. You should be able to see a chat box down there and the Q&A. So if you want to give that a test run so I know that you can hear me, that would be awesome. If you choose to all hosts and panelists, that should allow me to see it. If you choose everyone, you should be able to see that. Everybody should be able to see your comment there. We will also be taking audience questions throughout the discussion. So if there's something that is relevant to the group at large, we will be sure to touch on it. If your question is a little bit more nuanced, then we will be happy to provide a way for you to get in touch with Tom after the fact to make sure that you can have a little bit more in depth of a discussion. And then finally, this, as you can see, is recording and will be available once it's processed and posted. And we'll make sure to email that to you with the email address that you used to register. And if I don't get that out to you and you're like, hey, where is that sucker? Go ahead and email ati@govmates.com and we'll make sure to get it out to you. Just know that it does take a little bit of processing time, so usually I do not forget. This is where I get to introduce today's panelist and GovMate's friend from Dark Wolf Solutions. This is Tom Marlow. Tom, first, thank you for joining us. It's been a while since I've gotten to see you, so I'm excited to have this conversation. And second, can you tell us a little bit about who you are and what it is that you do?
Yeah, thank you so much, Meg. I'm excited to be here also. So Tom Marlow and I lead Dark Wolf Solutions cybersecurity practice. Dark Wolf Solutions is a cybersecurity and technology services firm. We provide cybersecurity development and DevOps, as well as digital transformation services to primarily government customers, but also to commercial customers. Within the cybersecurity practice, we have a couple of different areas where we do a lot of our work. We do a lot of red team assessments and penetration testing. We do computer forensics work. We do vulnerability research, finding 0 days. We also have a team of cybersecurity consultants that help with RMF compliance as well as with ATO compliance. And that's what I'm looking forward to talking with everyone today about. We've helped a couple of companies meet these ATO requirements that the government sets. And we've got some lessons learned now that we've done it a couple of times that we wanted to share with everyone.
That is perfect. And you really kind of hit on a lot of those agenda things for today. So we're going to chat through several topics, such as ATO, RMF, everything involved there, lessons learned, the fast track, a cheat sheet, which we love. And if I'm not mistaken, every time I see somebody from the Dark Wolf team, you guys are either celebrating something, going after something new, like there's so much that you guys are doing. And it's always fun to kind of catch up with you guys and see what's going on and what you're doing. So congratulations to all of that.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
So I'm going to turn the talking over to you, Tom. Don't forget to put questions in the Q&A or the chat so we don't miss them. And Tom, the floor is all yours.
All right. Thank you so much, Meg. So to kick things off, I wanted to be clear about the scope of this conversation. When we talk about providing cybersecurity support and complying with cybersecurity requirements with the government, we immediately jump to thinking about the CMMC. And that's not what this is about. Instead, we've worked with a lot of small businesses who have developed products. They could be startups out of Silicon Valley, out of the Austin market, or other parts of the country that have an app or a system or something, or even a piece of hardware that they want to sell to the government. And they are new to the government. It's a first-time customer for them. The conversations go well. They get to the point where they're about to make the sale. And then the government says that they need this company to complete something called an authority to operate. And that raises all kinds of questions as to what is an ATO, how do we get an ATO, and what does an ATO mean? So today, I want to break that down a little bit, provide some definitions of terms, provide some of those lessons learned, as well as practical guides for getting through this process, and perhaps color it as well with a couple of stories of events that we've been through. Next slide, please.
Perfect.
So I don't know if we have a way for, we do have a participant poll.
We do. I set it up. Gotta love
awesome.
Right?
So I love doing this just to gauge everyone's level of experience with authority to operate. And whether your company or perhaps you in another life working as a government employee or as a contractor employee, if you've been through the ATO process, I think the first question is, one, have you been through the ATO process with the government, with any agency? And what we'll dive into later is that they all have a different way of doing this. And then the second question I have is, how long did it take? And Meg, maybe we can give 30 seconds or so for people to respond.
Yeah, sure. Not a problem at all. Happy to wait for those responses to come in. I also love that every time I see ATO, I automatically think OTA, which is completely different. But we're so used to talking about that in the space that I was like, no, it's ATO.
Exactly. And an ATO might be required for the OTA, at which point you have to provide your COAs.
And then you're in an entirely different bucket of alphabet soup. So welcome back to it.
Exactly. And we can do separate presentations on all of those things.
Right. So if you have questions, we know people who have answers.
Yep. All right, do we want to see how responses look or move on to the next slide?
Sure. So we're looking at, I don't know if you can see that, about it says 43% of those who answered said yes and 57% said no.
Okay.
Then most people who said, how long did it take to complete? We had 33% said 6 to 9 months and others said 12 plus months.
That sounds about right. Absolutely. So we're also going to talk about some ways to potentially accelerate this too, if the customer that you're working with is open to that. So first, a definition: an authority to operate. What is it? So an authorizing official at your government customer has the authority to approve your software product as well as other software products to run in production. They make that decision based on an assessment of the risk presented by the security posture of your product to their networks and to their mission and to their objectives as well. There's a process that compiles a body of evidence that the authorizing official and their team may take a look at. The authorizing official and their team may also run their own security assessment of your product to make a determination as to whether or not an ATO is warranted. And then they have an option to grant the ATO, grant an ATO with conditions that have to be fixed in some set amount of time to continue the ATO, or to deny the ATO. The process to get to where that ATO decision is made by the authorizing official is the 7 steps of the risk management framework. And Meg, if you could go to the next slide, please. This is the risk management framework. So this is the key, and this is the whole process. The risk management framework is a good holistic process for thinking about the risks of your system, its inherent risks, the inherent controls that it needs, the other controls that it's going to need, and it really covers all areas of security that you could possibly think of. It also sets up the process for performing an assessment, granting an ATO, and then maintaining that ATO. It incorporates all kinds of different laws, executive orders, and directives. It also has been around for a long time. It dates back to the early 2000s when Congress originally passed the Federal Information Security Management Act. And the FISMA directed NIST to come up with the RMF, and we've had this process ever since. If you look around the graphic on the right, all of those different FIPS 200, 853, SP 800-128, for each step of the risk management framework, those are the guidance documents that NIST has put out that give you the details as to how to complete each step. And we'll give a little bit more detail for each step as well. But it's a significant body of evidence and a significant body of guidance that has to be adhered to in order to complete the process correctly. Now, we've worked with some customers to innovate on this, to perhaps focus on what presents the highest priorities or highest risks, to try to save some time and to save some effort, while at the same time not introducing or jeopardizing security in any way. But this is the basic structure. Next slide, please. So of all of those standards that were outside of that circle on the right for the risk management framework, these are what we would call the big 4. And I would honestly recommend that if you're new to the federal government, you're new to this process, or you have a product that needs to get an ATO, or you want to learn more about the ATO, I do recommend reading at the very least the first document on here, and that is NIST Special Publication 800-37 Revision 2, Risk Management Framework for Information Systems and Organizations. This is the umbrella guidance, if you will, for everything that's in the RMF. Everything else stems from this, and it provides authorization, overall processes, guides, and decision frameworks. What's really interesting about 800-37 is that it's flexible. Because the risk management framework has been around for over 20 years, over time, different processes have been ingrained within the institutional memory of different government organizations and agencies, and certain things have to be done certain ways, and there's a belief that NIST requires it. What NIST actually does is set up flexibility, which is really nice and gives us an opportunity to take advantage of some time and cost savings. The next two, the next two documents, 199 and 200, go together. But it's with these, especially 199, you consider what the risk of your system is going to be to agency operations. So for example, if a security breach happened with your product or a security issue occurred, would that just make for an inconvenient day for the customer organization? Could it potentially affect operations? Or could there potentially be a loss of life? And to help you make that decision, NIST has special publication 800-60, which actually steps through different types of information systems, and it gives recommended levels and protection levels for confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And once you have those in place, and FIPS 200 will tell you what your minimum control baseline is going to be. 800-60 is interesting in that it includes financial systems, payroll systems, HR systems, but it even includes disaster response systems, emergency preparedness systems. And so it covers a very broad spectrum to give you that guidance. Once you work through 200, you then get to what the control baseline is, which then takes you to NIST 800 special publication 800-53. And I have revision 4 and revision 5 here. But 800-53 is the controls catalog. It is over 500 pages long of 10-point font. It is huge. It has every control that you could possibly need without some additional controls that we'll discuss in a moment. But it provides controls, control enhancements. It gives you implementation guidance, and essentially, you have to demonstrate that you've met each one of the controls that's required for your system based on its categorization from 199 and 200. And different organizations have different requirements for how this sets up. The sub-bullets here also, revision 4 and revision 5. Revision 4 has been in place for the last couple of years, and systems have had to obtain an ATO to revision 4 requirements. Now most agencies are shifting to revision 5, and that creates a delta of new controls that have to be incorporated into the system that also have to be documented, implemented, and assessed. So that's just something to consider and a question to ask as well, whether or not the organization is following revision 4 or revision 5. But these are the big four to be familiar with. Meg, next slide, please.
It doesn't sound like there's an audiobook option for these, so I think you might actually have to read them.
And a cross-country drive to get through that audiobook, yes.
Right, can you imagine?
So RMF step details. So this goes back to the circle that we presented in the that we presented earlier. I wanted to break down some of the activities that are specific to each of these steps, with a highlight on significant artifacts that get produced, as well as actions that will be performed by the authorizing official as opposed to the company with the product. So the first step is prepare system, and this is actually a new step for the risk management framework. This is really more of a project management step than anything else. Here you're discussing your overall approach, your schedule, and identifying key points of contact and maybe common controls that can be applied. So common controls are controls that your tool or product might be able to inherit from its environment. An example of that would be if you were to deploy your product into AWS GovCloud. Amazon Web Services GovCloud makes available a number of security protections that you can inherit and claim as yours that don't necessarily need to be assessed separately. So that's just one thing to keep in mind working through this process. Categorizing the system is that FIPS 199 and 200 process I talked about earlier. And this is where you also start probably one of the most important documents of this process, which is the system security plan. Here, you will also identify overlays, which we'll talk about in a moment, as well as really set up who's going to be doing what to get through the rest of the process. Once you have categorized your system, you select controls from 800-53, and those will get documented in probably two different places. One, at a high level, is the system security plan. But then at a very detailed level, there's usually a control requirements traceability matrix, which is an Excel spreadsheet. And that is going to list all the 800-53 controls that apply to your system. We've created a template that we use for our projects that has all of the controls with built-in filters to immediately, to filter out certain controls based on what's applicable to a specific protection level, as well as incorporating different overlays. Then there's implementing controls. Implementing controls can take the form of writing policies and procedures, and we'll get into what some of those are in a moment, as well as potentially making system changes to implement control requirements. So for example, if your product is new to the federal government, one of the things you might have to build into it is a DoD acceptable, if you're going to do business with the DoD, is a DoD acceptable use banner. That's a new requirement for anyone coming into the government, but it's standard across all government systems. There's also then assess controls. Now, this step per the chart here is performed by the authorizing official and their team. However, we strongly recommend that the owners of the product perform a pre-assessment themselves against all the requirements we've talked about, so as to make this step go quicker, to demonstrate to the agency, to the customer, and to the AO that you're prepared to get through this process, and that you've already thought through what the risks are, you know what they are, you've documented them, and you're ready to mitigate them. Once the system assessment process is complete, we then move into authorizing the system. Here, one of the key documents is the plan of action and milestones. This is also typically a spreadsheet, although sometimes it gets moved into a tool, where it will list out each of the findings from the security assessment. Those could be managerial. For example, a policy was missing, or a policy didn't have the detail that was needed, or it could be technical. There was a lack of a patch had not been applied, or perhaps the system didn't comply with certain password requirements. All of that's listed in the POAM, along with who's responsible for mitigating or fixing it, the mitigating or fixing plan, and then a time frame. The goal here, before moving into the authorized system step, is not perfect security. That's impossible, and the AOs recognize and realize that. But they want to make sure that residual risks are known and mitigated or accepted. So here with the authorizing system, eventually the AO and their team will take over the package. They'll look through it, they'll consider the system, and they will make the authorize or do not authorize decision. Once that's done, this process isn't necessarily over. Historically, especially when the RMF first came out, an accreditation for a system was done when the system came online, and then it was done again every 3 years. These days, given that security threats change so quickly, technology changes quickly, systems are changing, most authorizing officials are looking for continuous monitoring activities. So that's going to include having a change control board and managing changes to the application, ensuring that there's security monitoring tools in place, keeping logs, whether that's in the form of Elastic or Splunk or one of those, as well as and perhaps too, an annual reassessment, perhaps in the form of a penetration test, to make sure that nothing significant has changed that would necessarily encourage or drive the authorizing official to feel like maybe they need to change their accreditation decision. And then that's sort of where this process today, it's once you get to there, you kind of loop back again to categorizing the system and working all the way through it again. That's also part of continuous monitoring.
So when you said like 3 years, you're like, oh, it's done every 3 years. I was like, that's like an eon in our industry. I was like, who's doing 3-year things now? And so
Not
it makes
anymore.
more sense about the continuous monitoring, which is why you're seeing such a push for that at this point.
Yes, we are seeing more and more customers are, who have products to offer to the government are really hitting this ATO step. And the government takes it very seriously because they don't want to introduce new risks into their production networks. And the ATO it's becoming a very large conversation across all of industry.
Of course. And as you mentioned, they're not looking for perfection, but they're definitely looking to mitigate whatever they can, if it can be potentially, taken care of or at least noted.
Exactly. And the key here is through documentation to show your work. And I think that's probably the number one way you help to settle the concerns of most authorizing officials and their teams.
So you're telling me 3rd grade math class is coming back to haunt me. I'm still
exactly. When I got partial credit and still passed.
Got it. Good to know.
These are other compliance requirements that might come into consideration in addition to what's in NIST 800-53. So, for example, if your system is a national security system, it will have to comply with CNSSI 1253. That could be within the DoD, it could be within the intelligence community. Likely that system is processing classified data on a classified network. Your system could be subject to HIPAA, which is the Federal Privacy Protections for Healthcare data. So if you have a healthcare application or tool that you're potentially marketing to, whether it's DoD and one of its healthcare agencies or HHS or one of those, there would be a set of HIPAA controls you also have to comply with. Less common is payment card industry. That's more of a commercial standard, though, although it does come up. And then DoD impact levels will drive the requirements for additional controls as well. So these are all things to take into consideration based on what the business purpose of your product is going to be. So to summarize, these are the key artifacts that come out of that ATO process. We hit on a couple of them, but just to recap and expand a little bit, the first major artifact is the system security plan that will have the system risk categorization that was created through the 199 and 200 process, responsible organizations, it highlights the boundaries. And what the system security plan will also do is reference other policies. So for example, the system security plan will say that we have a change management policy, we have an incident response policy. The authorizing official and their team may want to see those policies also. So another significant piece of work in this process is going through and building all of those other policies and plans that are going to be referenced by the system security plan. There's policies and other documents across all 17 of the NIST control families that need to be addressed, and we've listed just a few examples here. The next major artifact is the control matrix. That is the catalog or the inventory of all of those 800-53 controls that you had to implement for your system. The way different agencies have addressed this, and I'll pick on DoD for a second, they have a tool called EMAS. I can't remember off the top of my head what EMAS stands for, but EMAS is their system of record that you have met all of these risk management framework requirements. So it will hold the system security plan, it will hold all those policies and procedures, and it will also lay out all of the controls that had to be complied with. There's other tools out there, DHS has its own version of EMAS, and then some organizations also use proprietary or commercial tools like Exacta or SD Elements to document controls as well. So there's a couple of different solutions here. The next is the test report. I would recommend that you've performed your own self-assessment and you have your own test report, but the AO and their team is also going to produce their test report. So that's the third key document. And then the fourth key document is the POAM. And I would argue that really documents 1, 2, and 4 are all living documents. Throughout the continuous monitoring life cycle, they're going to be updated or they're going to be referenced regularly. The other activity that might be required by the AO is for you to run STIG and ACAS scans. STIGs are a whole nother library of recommended system configuration settings for different operating systems, different tools, different applications that the AO may want to see in place before they're willing to grant an authorization. And STIGs are put out by DISA, if I recall correctly, and they're all referenceable online. And there's some tools out there to help you work through the STIG processes that can be a pretty significant level of effort and lift to get through.
And Matt did jump in and tell us that EMAS is Enterprise Mission Assurance Support Service. So appreciate that.
That's it. Yes. Thank you so much.
I was like, that's a lot of syllables right there.
So lessons learned. We've helped a number of companies with products that they wanted to sell to the government. They were at the finish line. All they needed to do was sign the contract, and the government had told them that, hey, we need an ATO. And those customers had come to us asking, what's an ATO? And we engaged with them to work through this process. One of the things that we always ask for first is a network diagram and an inventory of the tech stack. These are very basic documents that help us and that help the authorizing official scope out your system and to understand all the different pieces are involved. And by that, understand the risks and security requirements. We have worked with customers that didn't have these in place because they just were never required previously. And so these are very important to have. The next, and I think probably other most significant piece of advice we can give is to know who is going to be the authorizing official or know who their delegates are or who their team is. So we have had companies come to us wanting to engage, and we will not sign the contracts until those customers can, and we'll help them, but help them find out who the authorizing official is. Because if we don't know who that is, then there's a huge risk that we're going to develop a lot of shelfware and it's not going to go anywhere. We want to know to who this documentation is going to go to before we start to build it. So that's absolutely key. Also, for internal resource planning purposes, the technical teams are going to have to be involved in this process. That could be administrators, developers. It could also be other engineers, security engineers, to answer questions and potentially get ready to make updates to the product to meet security requirements. The next is that team members should ideally be US citizens. This doesn't necessarily mean everybody in the company needs to be a US citizen, but especially if you're selling to the national security market, the DoD, intel community, law enforcement organizations, ideally the team for the product are US citizens. We've seen a couple of startups that have come out of places like Silicon Valley or Austin, Texas, who had completely offshored their development, and in order to work with the government, had to then go through the changes to onshore the development to US citizens. We've seen that happen at least once. The next is that while we're talking about US citizens, is to talk about working in classified systems. So it is possible that customers want to bring your products onto their classified systems. That doesn't necessarily mean they're going to make it easy. So the lesson learned here for classified systems is that if you are new to the federal government, you're likely going to have to partner with a company that already has access to a classified network. The way the clearance process works, both for your company as well as for your employees, it's essentially a flow down from the government to a company that has the clearances to you. And that takes time to put in place, anywhere from a couple of weeks to, unfortunately, a couple of months. But in order to do classified work, it's important to build that into your schedule, as well as to know who might be willing to sponsor you or to bring you on as a subcontractor so that you can take on those clearances and gain that access. We talked about this next one earlier, but there will be software changes that will likely need to be made to comply with government requirements. A DoD banner is the most obvious one that jumped to our mind as we were putting together this presentation. And then change also has to be controlled. Even though there's continuous monitoring, part of that continuous monitoring is to monitor for changes. So we've worked with companies new to the federal government that when they need to make changes, they just put the user stories into the sprint cycles and just go. And they may or may not document it. There may or may not be a JIRA trail. It's varied. But if you're now doing business with the government, changes need to be tracked, controlled, and approved. And there needs to be an assessment as to whether or not the change is significant enough to impact the security posture of the system, triggering a potential reassessment. Now, that kind of change is usually either something that's being made directly to the security controls or a whole new module is being added to the system. Those are usually very significant changes. It doesn't need to happen for every change, but it's important to make sure that all changes are documented. Next slide, please. In addition to documentation, like we said earlier, the governments may require STIG and ACAS scans. And one other NIST standard I want to bring up that didn't fit very neatly into the previous slides was 140-2, security requirements for cryptographic modules. If one of the security controls that you have to comply with is that your data is encrypted, then you need to comply with this. And this establishes requirements and security controls for encrypting data at rest and in transit. We've encountered a number of systems that had to do this from scratch in order to make the ATO requirements. It just had not previously been considered or built in. One thing that we also want to bring up, we've talked about that body of evidence, the system security plan, all the policies and procedures, the control matrix. The authorizing official could want, regular updates and work with that. It may not just be a one and done. We talked earlier about ATOs being a set time frame. Now, they're still set to max out at 3 years usually. That's still in place, even with continuous monitoring. But a number of agencies and government programs are moving away from that as they move towards continuous monitoring. And there will be continuous updates throughout the process. However, the other reason to continue with the continuous updates to actively work security and compliance throughout the system development lifecycle is that you don't want to get to a point where maybe it's at the 3-year mark or it's at a 1-year mark. The government decides it wants to reassess. you want to avoid having to make a Herculean effort to comply, which is what this always used to be with the 3-year cycle. It was all of these things waited until about 6 to 7 months out from the end of the 3 years, and everything else had to go to the side while the developers and the system owners got their system ready for the next ATO exercise. So we encourage continuous monitoring to also stay on top of compliance throughout the software lifecycle. Another thing to understand, and we'll talk about FedRAMP in a moment, but an ATO with one agency or program does not transfer to another agency or program. So if you have, even within DoD, if you have something with Army, the Navy may not accept it. The civilian agencies are much the same. There are RMF requirements that apply that are for the entire government. Then each individual agency typically has their own RMF compliance requirements in the way they want to see things done. And then individual programs may have their own modifications to those requirements as well. So it doesn't ship across the government very readily. That said, there could be opportunities working with the authorization official to take advantage of reciprocity, or to convince them that what was done for another customer will also work for them. And perhaps all they want to see is another quick assessment, or they want to see the results of the original assessment rather than requiring their own assessment. So through that, you can save time and resources trying to get through the process and using what you may have already built for another customer. Same here as, using enterprise services, cloud native services for logging and authentication and authorization can also help satisfy a lot of RMF controls. But be ready. An ATO at one organization does not mean it's an ATO at another organization.
Is there any push to kind of standardize that between agencies, or are they just kind of like, we like our own stuff, we all want, like, they have to know? It's kind of like a CUIA sort of thing.
I think that we are seeing perhaps a push by executives at the CIO level to inform more reciprocity and accept other ATOs. When you get down to the program level, where they're much more familiar with the risks, the operations, the customers, then there's a little more reluctance. So it's a gradient. But with FedRAMP especially, there's definitely been a push to try to make it that one ATO will satisfy the government. But I think there could still be work involved, just in case you're operating in a completely unclassified environment in one area, but now you're going to move into a controlled and classified environment in another. They're going to want to see that those deltas are addressed in the control requirements. Right.
It's more of that. We want to make sure that we are covered, that you're meeting our standards, sort of thing. I understand that it would be great to have that, across industry, just to be like, hey, we already did it here, we proved it, here's all the paperwork. But I also understand the side of like, hey, I have to answer for this if something goes down, and I need to make sure I have dotted all of my I's and crossed all of my T's.
That is exactly a large driver.
Right.
And then we've talked a lot about the authorizing official, and I just want to give one or two things that we've learned. So authorizing officials, AOs, are executive officials. These are typically flag level officers in the military or SESers in the civilian world. It can be very difficult to get on their calendars. Usually they have delegated their responsibilities to a team. The team can consist of an information security manager, security control assessors, or other folks. At the end of the day, it's still the AO's signature that goes on to the authorization letter. But at the same time, you're likely not going to work with them. You're going to work with your team, although there are definitely have been exceptions to that, where we have worked directly with the AOs. Every AO is different and cares differently about degrees of risk also. So one AO, for example, we've had programs where all the authorizing official wanted was a security playbook. So not even a system security plan, just a playbook of reminders and best practices for security, and a penetration test. And they were good. And then we've had others who wanted that full body of knowledge, that full body of evidence before granting the authorization official. And that's why it's so critical to understand who the AO is, who their team is, and what their expectations are before engaging with them, so that you don't either, one, spend a lot of time on work and effort that doesn't need to be done, or spend it on the wrong thing. AOs are generally not technical SMEs. They're SMEs for their business or mission area. So they understand the impact of a system going down on their ability for their mission to accomplish its job. So it's important that when you're working with them, to translate security controls into ensuring mission success. That's an important connection that needs to be made in order to demonstrate the merit of your tool, as well as to help them understand what the risks of the tool really are to the job that they need to get done.
Is it possible? Now, I know we talk a lot in like the bid side, the proposal side about having the relationship with your contracting officer and like making sure that you have those conversations and like you get to know them, blah blah. If it's really hard to get on an AO's calendar, right? I would assume it's difficult to build that kind of relationship where you can have that back and forth. Are the teams more accessible in a way that you can kind of build that so that you can have that back and forth to kind of mitigate some of those questions or issues ahead of time, or is that less important than just kind of the question and answer short piece?
No, usually, yes. Sometimes the teams are more available. So and being an AO is never an AO, with one or two exceptions. Being an AO is usually not an AO's full-time job at all. But for their team, it is. And so we've had good experiences setting up, whether it's, weekly or even daily cadence meetings with ISMs or authorizing official teams to make sure that we were doing everything according to their expectations. And certainly you can, if you have a close relationship with the customer that wants to buy your product, as part of that close relationship with them before they purchase your product, you can work with them to meet the security team. We've seen that happen a couple of times as well, and begin to engage with them before you've even made the sale or before it's transitioned to their network, and to start that swim lane as soon as possible.
And I think that goes back to one of your previous points about your lessons learned, which is getting your technical team involved.
Yep.
So this is not just like a administrative level thing. You have to have people who know what's going on to have the conversations and be in the room. Otherwise, you're just wasting time.
Because you are going to get very technical questions.
Right. And most people who, are not in the weeds in that, they probably have no, they have an idea, but they're not going to have the specifics necessary.
Exactly. All right, now, is it possible to speed this up? This is the number one question we get from both the government and from commercial customers. So our answer is yes. We have actually had some luck speeding this up with different organizations that have been willing to lean forward, and it's on an AO by AO basis, and we call it the fast track ATO. And I'll get into the major components of it on the next slide. But the goal of the fast track ATO is to move away from the exhaustion of Microsoft documents to demonstrate security and take a look at the actual security. So this is another area where, every 3 years you produced an updated pile of Microsoft Office documents. Did that really mean you were secure? Yeah, I don't know. That's a tough call. Whereas a penetration test will show, or a red team engagement will show much more quickly whether or not security is in place. And we'll talk in a minute about some customers that have moved towards this. It's allowed for by NIST 800-37 in that it provides that flexibility for ongoing authorization, from which we derive the fast track ATO authority for those customers that we've used it with. Meg, can you move on to the next slide, please? So these are the fast track elements where we've really tried to boil down everything into a much simpler approach, if you will. And there's three major components. The first is the cybersecurity baseline. So we're still producing a system security plan and probably some subset of the security policies. However, what usually doesn't get done is these control traceability matrix, or we do a smaller one. So take an average software as a service product, maybe medium security risks, nothing classified, nothing even QE. There's probably 1,400 controls out of 800-53 that it needs to comply with. But we worked with one customer to narrow that down to 150 controls plus a penetration test. And that formed what went into the system security plan. That then goes into the risk-based assessment, where we did a manual test of 140 controls as opposed to 1,400, and then did a thorough penetration test to actually see applying the same techniques that an insider threat would apply, or a nation state actor would apply, or a script kiddie would apply, to see if we could potentially breach the security or not. And based on the combination of those two things, plus a continuous monitoring strategy, so developing a formal document and plan around those continuous monitoring elements we mentioned earlier, those three things taken together form the basis of a fast track ATO. And it saved months off of this process. However, it's an AO by AO basis. Some are comfortable with it, some are not, and either way is fine. But this is available, and convincing an organization to go this route is more of a change management activity as opposed to a cybersecurity activity. And that's something that we've had experience with doing, and that's been our major finding, is that we almost bring in more of the management consultant type to convince a customer to go this route as opposed to the cybersecurity employees. Meg, can you go to the next slide, please?
I can. So you're doing this ahead of time, like you're getting permission ahead of time versus putting all the effort into doing this and then be like, hey, we already did the things, because it's not going to save you if you try and do this first.
Correct. Yep.
And they
if
get back
you don't
and be
have
like,
agreement first,
right? You're just going to upset your AO, and we don't want to do that.
Absolutely. It's going to look like you tried to shortchange security, and that's
right?
not going to go over well.
No.
Just as a quick, memorandum, you can find these via Google searches, but the Air Force really embraced this model. So in 2019, the deputy CIO of the Air Force at the time signed a memo that, even in the memo, it said the ATO approval process, as it has developed over time under the risk management framework, it's very resource intensive. So although we want lots of great security, it costs time, it costs money, and it uses up limited resources. On top of that, if you're only doing it once every 3 years, it's not keeping pace with cyber threats. So they wanted something that kept pace with cyber threats in more real time and could be applied more often and get beyond what's in the documents. What does the system actually look like? And so they provided a fast track overview and a sample decision brief. And we worked with the Air Force on a couple of occasions to do this, and they really embraced it. We had a lot of success with a number of Air Force systems. And in October of 2020, the Undersecretary issued a follow-up memorandum, which is also available publicly, that states that fast track ATO is the ideal way to get an ATO for new systems. There are some systems that are not good candidates for fast track. Those could be systems that are legacy or very old and are up for ATO renewals. They may not be able to withstand a penetration test, and a pen test may cause service interruptions. The other use case that's not ideal are for very large, complex systems with lots of different components. It's possible maybe pieces of it could be assessed through fast track, but likely a fast track isn't going to work for the entire system.
I think we typically see, or at least assume, that the government is like, they're going to move at the speed of government. So it's nice to see that they're taking this and actually writing it down and saying, hey, we get it. Like, we know that it's not as fast as it needs to be. And I think that that's a typical thing that we talk about, is the fact that technology is advancing at such a rate that we are working to keep up and to get ahead of it. And so we need, our agencies to do the same.
Yep, exactly. I did want to throw in a quick note about FedRAMP. I think this is especially applicable to companies that are looking to market new products to the government, especially cloud-based products. So FedRAMP, there's a lot of great information from the GSA available for it online. They've set up a great set of websites to help walk you through the requirements, the process, and the benefits. And the nice thing about FedRAMP is that if you have a cloud service offering, like a SaaS product or an infrastructure as a service product, the goal here was that an ATO through FedRAMP should then be good across the government. And what FedRAMP really does is give you a provisional ATO, such that if an organization, let's pick on Office of Personnel Management, wanted to then buy your product that had a FedRAMP provisional ATO, there's only a few steps that have to be completed for them to accept that. Maybe they have a few custom things that they looked at. Otherwise, they're going to rely on the work that was done with FedRAMP. In the playbook, whether or not you're considering this approach, and this approach, when you get down to the nuts and bolts of it, is very similar to what we just discussed, the whole risk management framework. But per the playbook, if you're new to the federal government and you only have perhaps 1 or 2 customers, you should probably work with those customers to just don't worry about going through FedRAMP. Just work with those customers to get your ATO. However, if you've been doing work with the government for a long time, you're at more than one organization, and you feel that your addressable market is a bunch of different agencies, then it could be to your benefit to then work directly with FedRAMP, because there are going to be costs with FedRAMP to work through this process, to have the security assessment done, and it takes time. But once it's done, that provisional ATO goes across the full government.
I love that you made that note about it being not necessarily perfect for everybody, depending on your customer base. Because I think sometimes we try and get ahead of things. We say, oh, I'm going to do all the things, but that could be an extra expense that you just don't want to incur right now, given the fact that you have other things that you're working on.
Exactly. Yes. All right. And I think this is just about the last slide, but we wanted to give just a practical work breakdown structure of here's everything at a high level that needs to get done to get an ATO if you are selling a product, be it hardware or software, to the federal government and you're new to this process and they have asked you to get an ATO. That process is, again, conducting a kickoff meeting with stakeholders, get to know the authorizing official and their team, or at least their team. And their team may act as a go between the authorizing official and you. Develop a roadmap with schedules, milestones, and responsibilities for the process. There's going to be dependencies on you and on the government. So you want to make sure that all of those dependencies are out in the open. So if any delays are encountered, you know which party is responsible, and that can help you in the long run. Obtaining system accounts, especially if it's classified system access, can take some time. So it's important to build that into your schedule. Unclassified access may go pretty quickly. Classified access could take weeks to months. So it's important to know that probably during the kickoff meeting or even before, you want to start the access request process as soon as your customer will let you, because it can take a lot of time to get done. The next step is to educate stakeholders on ATO options, such as going for a full ATO versus a fast track ATO and seeing if they would be comfortable with a fast track ATO or not. Once you've agreed on the ATO approach, you've got the system access and a plan forward, then it really comes down to building the ATO deliverables. And so that's that architecture diagram, hardware, software list, building out the system security plan. And there's also templates for system security plans available online. You can model your template off the one that FedRAMP offers, for example. Then it's determining the system categorization, selecting controls, assisting the team with the implementation of those controls, writing all the policies and procedures, performing a self-assessment and drafting the POAM, and then submitting a package to the authorizing official, answering questions to support as needed. So what you'll find is, I guess it's a little hurry up and wait, but when you submit the package to the AO, you'll have to wait to hear from them when they have questions or as they move through the process. We typically find that getting everything done through about steps 1.4.7, assuming that a lot of assumptions here, that you have a motivated customer that wants to help you get through this process. It's going to make those connections for you and ensure things are moving along. For everything to get done on the company's end is probably 2 to 3 months. And then with a fast track ATO, maybe it's only 1 more month of assessment work on the government's end. But if it's not, then we can start to get into some of the 6 to 9 month timeframes for the ATO. However, the company's part hopefully can get done in 2 to 3 months. The one thing that can sometimes make that take longer is getting access to government networks. And then ideally, at the end, the authorizing official awards the ATO and you move into continuous monitoring, your product deploys to their network and they start purchasing more licenses.
It's all of the good things that you were looking for in the beginning.
Exactly.
Perfect. But I like that it's broken out here in a way that's understandable, and it shows really what your requirements are and what you're supposed to be doing before you even hand it over to anybody.
Yep.
Perfect. I do know that we have a quick question here that says, we are working on a DoD provision authorization through direct Army sponsorship surpassing FedRAMP. But once we have that, is there a reciprocity path back to FedRAMP authorization?
I would say so there's not necessarily a direct FedRAMP sponsored way of doing it, but you're building a lot of the artifacts that FedRAMP is going to want. So it's build once and hopefully use many times. And I should have maybe highlighted that earlier. Likely the system security plan is not going to have to change a whole lot between what the Army wants and what FedRAMP wants. Same with the other artifacts, policies, procedures, and matrices that you're building. So the nice thing is you go through that heavy lift the first time, and then when you have to do it again, the lift is less heavy. I'm not aware of any direct, I haven't heard of FedRAMP accepting someone else's ATO to inform the provisional ATO. As far as I know, they still want to perform their own security assessment through a 3PAO, third-party assessment.
I was saying more of that alphabet soup there. Yep. I appreciate that you kind of made that mention as well. I was curious if we talked, like we said, a little bit about like from agency to agency. I'm always stuck up on that because we would love for things to be a little bit more accessible across the board. But as you said, if we're going from, Army to FedRAMP, the thought process being that hopefully what you've already created will be easily usable for the next day. You just may have to change the format or whatever it is that they're looking for. But hopefully the stuff that you've already created is going to be able to not necessarily copy paste, but like copy kind of paste.
Exactly right. Yes.
And you guys can help kind of walk through that based upon agency, correct?
Yes, correct. And we have, all of the different overlays built in. We can quickly call up which controls are going to be required. We've also got our talking points where we've convinced agencies to use a fast track ATO. We have success stories from other agencies that we can run by the AO. We can put them in touch with different points of contact to try to convince them that perhaps that's the way to go.
So it's good to have somebody like Dark Wolf in your pocket.
I would like to think so.
Right. It seems like you guys already have the knowledge and you have the experience. You kind of know what's going on. So it's nice to know that there's somebody there who's done it before, especially if you're getting into this and you're not going through the FedRAMP space, because you only have a couple of those customers. It would be nice to have somebody who, kind of knows the ropes before you get into it and put those resources and that time out into the space.
Yes. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for kind of giving us that overview. That was great time-wise. I'm always impressed at how you're able to share so much information in such a concise fashion. So I always appreciate that. So like I said, big thanks, Tom, and the Dark Wolf Solutions team, as well as everybody in the audience for joining us today. This will, like I said, be available as a replay, and I will email that out once it's finished. If you have other questions, you're welcome to email those to either myself or the ATI@govmates.com website or email address. We can always get those to you and then pass them over to Tom should he have the opportunity to answer those for you. You can always follow everybody who's here. So Tom, myself, GovMates, Dark Wolf. I highly recommend following Dark Wolf on LinkedIn. You guys have some really great content over there that I always find entertaining. So
as do you all also. I like following your stuff too.
Thank you. We do like our LinkedIn, right?
Yes, absolutely.
And as a reminder, we are going to be at the Defense Tech Connect on November 29th, so right after the holiday. That is at the National Harbor for the R&D Capital Summit. So that is sponsored by ATI. So if anyone is in town and is looking to, get a little bit more information on some of that capital conversation, would love to have you there. I do know that you can get a free ticket to that portion of the event and part of the expo using the code that we have on our website. So that's at govmates.com/collaborate. And then we are also hosting our final event of 2023, which is crazy to say because Thanksgiving is just next week, in Tyson's Corner on November 30th. So we're doing R&D Capital event, and then we're doing the GovMates Holiday Bash in Tyson's Corner. So you can grab tickets at that same website, govmates.com/collaborate. Like I said, if you have additional questions post-webinar, let us know. We'll be sure to get you answers ASAP. We hope you have a great rest of this week and a really happy, healthy holiday season, kicking it off with Thanksgiving. And we look forward to seeing you both in person or online at one of our upcoming events. So Tom, thank you so much.
Thank you, Meg. This has been wonderful.
And we'll see everybody on the next one. Have a great rest of your week.
Sure.